Phenomena. Do 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 do.
Phenomena.
Do 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 do.
Phenomena.
All right, Rose.
Yes, Data. Yes, Data.
I want to know, is your gain adjusted?
I have adjusted this gain in every possible configuration from here to Alaska. And I'm still trying to determine which setting creates a non-tinny sound in the brand new, somewhat expensive mic that I just bought to do podcasts to improve.
More learnings about what it takes to do a podcast. I don't know what gain even is, but I know that it's important that it's adjusted. So learning there.
And it's what's the right adjustment?
I know. And then I have also learned how many times in the course of a sort of half hour, 45-minute interview, I say the words like or you know. And it bothers me deeply that I am doing that so much. So, personal growth, I've got something to work on.
If we were in college, we'd do a drinking game around that.
Yeah, exactly.
Like Bob Newhart. Remember the Bob Newhart game? Bob.
Yeah. Or in The Princess Bride, when Buttercup is melodramatic. You know what I mean? Like, so good. All right. What's on your mind?
I have to tell you, I am somewhat fascinated and also slightly disturbed about the level of interest around whether the Kate Middleton photo is real or Memorex. I can't even wrap my head around why, and maybe I don't live in the UK, so though I have interest in the royal family, I'm much less consumed than the pop culture media seems to be about the number of edits in that photo and whether it's real or fabricated. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah. Okay. So a few weeks ago for UK Mother's Day, photo comes out. It's immediately flagged by a bunch of different social media and other things as edited. Yes.
And by the AP, by reputable news, not like just TikTok, right?
Right. Saying this is an altered image and they start blocking it. I think it was unquestionably altered. I think the question is, was it just her playing around like she said, or was it them truly sort of pasting her into a photo of children so that she wasn't even there? You know what I mean? And yeah, I think this is a case of one of those where it wasn't on people's minds all that much. And now it's really is because of this doctored photo. So it's just weird. It's an interesting to see the phenomenon grow. By the time we're doing this podcast, it might have settled down, but it sure has been one hell of a tempest.
It created 2 points of concern for me. One is a bit of a reach, but one is a little bit of a reflection back to something that Tara said, which is if you're explaining, you're losing. And there's a whole lot of explaining, which is doing nothing but fueling the fire right now. And then the other thing that I just think is a warning for all of us, especially as we get deeper into this election year, is check and make sure you're checking your sources. There's going to be a lot of AI created content, a lot of editing, a lot of modification. Just check your sources.
Yeah, and in a way, I'm really glad that it was caught, right? I mean, what do I know about Kate and William? But I don't want them to be getting all kinds of grief. On the other hand, I'm glad the system worked in that somehow for reputable news outlets, there was recognition that this photo had been altered. And I think that is great. I'm really glad to see that.
As was I.
Exactly. All right, Rose, what's on deck?
Well, we are excited to present part 2, which will be season 2, episode 6 of our Liz McLean interview. And you're going to hear some really interesting insights around things like the criticality of team alignment, including the principles for the organization and how relevant that was for Liz as she thinks through her future of work and work environment decisions and how that affects a leader's decision. How being in the office kind of creates opportunity for those earlier in career in terms of networking interaction if you're not there. And then finally, the balance between the what and the how as a leader. And we talk about this often. So it was really exciting to hear Liz's perspective and her reinforcement of that what and how approach, and being intentional on collaboration and other behaviors that allow you to achieve results. So with that, let's get to the second part of the Liz McLean interview.
The way we work was disrupted by the pandemic. And I don't necessarily think that's a bad thing. I think the 5-day on-site work week evolved way before technology enabled other things. So why not rethink? But of course, there's now it's just all kinds of debate and sometimes a lot of conflict and tension around what's the appropriate way to work now. And we're talking, in sort of classic office and corporate settings where there is flexibility. And so, what in your setting, pharma or biotech or however you want to think about it, what have you seen the space doing to pivot to post-pandemic reality around the way of work?
Yeah, everything. I mean, really,
That's what it seems like, Liz. Everything.
Over the map. I think we're going to learn a lot. 5 years from now, we're going to have a really cool point of view about, what did we learn about what works well and what types of environments and what kind of implications did it have. But today, I mean, I've been parts of organizations that have, fully remote's great. You choose what you want to do. That's fine. Everybody needs to come in at least 3 days a week. Somewhere in the middle of that, it's really all over the map. And I think there's lots of research and articles today that will guide you down different paths without a clear, trade-off listed in that space.
Yeah. I love that you just brought up that there's trade-offs to every choice. There's probably not the perfect thing. There's going to be a trade-off. And so from a super practical level, so, some companies, and again, there's pros and cons to this, say to the manager, you can figure it out with your team. Just figure it out. So speaking of learning, what would you recommend? And I mean, I know this is off the top of your head, but what would you recommend to a manager who says, let's try this model? And how would you recommend that they work with their staff to learn what's working and adjust? What would be practical block and tackle way to think about that?
I would start with an alignment meeting of the team and say, okay, we're presented with this choice about how we're going to work together, and do a session that's around what do we know already about what it takes to be a great team or to accomplish the things that we need to accomplish. And you could do a session that's great teams I've been a part of and crappy teams I've been a part of. And what did we learn from those things, and see, do those apply here where we are? And then having, I just recently did this with my team, doing some of your principles. What are the principles that we have for our work? So for example, if one of the principles that you have is deep stakeholder engagement, part of that decision about where your team works is how do the stakeholders that we work with work, and how are we actually going to be able to get in front of them and work together? So breaking apart a little bit, start with what are the principles that we have that guide our work? Deep stakeholder involvement, a one company approach to things, that we're going to pilot and learn from stuff. And then from there, figure out, well, what are the trade-offs if we did this, if we were all in person on site, what would that enable for our principals? If we were working remotely, what would that enable? And do that trade-off together so everybody has their eyes open to it. And Dana, I think you were actually asking me post the decision.
Yeah. And then how do you, right. So you make your decision, and then how do you learn what's working? Yeah.
Yeah. And I would use the principles probably as my anchor to say okay, now we've made this decision to do X model. How are we doing operationalizing those principles that we had as a team? Are we doing well with our stakeholder engagement? Are we able to brainstorm and pilot things together in an effective way? or not based on that decision, and is where we're located having an impact on that.
Yeah, that I think those are great insights to compare your principles to the impact and the effect on those principles. I actually hadn't thought about that. So that's a great learning for me. I'm going to continue along this theme a bit because what we've seen is a pretty pervasive media narrative that's suggesting a reluctance amongst all workers, because, it's never nuanced. It's always very black and white, to return to an office setting, and leaders advocating for more stringent work at work policies. I can think about the leader at Amazon are getting a huge amount of scrutiny when they make those decisions, which in my lens, it is their decision since they're the leader of the organization. What are you seeing on the ground relative to that narrative? And then I'll share with you some of the, like, what I'd call very unscientific research that we've been doing. And how do you see that affecting recruitment and retention of talent?
Yeah, I mean, it's a big inflection point, I think, for people overall. And we're such creatures of habit. Like, whatever we get used to, that is what we are used to doing. And it is really hard to pivot away from that. It is human behavior. We organize our whole lives around it. We've figured it out. For example, the previous company I was at was a Microsoft Teams shop for all of our, trainings and video calls. And here, where I am now, we're a Zoom shop. And I'm like, I have no idea how to do anything. And it's like, really? Click a button.
Oh, Dana, she's actually really good with Zoom.
It's not that hard. But I am like so aware of my resistance. I'm like, well, I can't put any GIFs in the chat. So this is garbage. How are we going to
Garbage, I tell you.
Right? And then people have the exact opposite experience. And I've had that now when I talk to vendors who use Teams. I'm like, wait, how do I do it? You just kind of get used to what you're used to. And I think there's a bit of that's happening. There's a portion of the population for whom that's what's happening, where they're now used to working maybe remotely, being able to figure out their life schedule with just sitting in their homes and working remotely. And there's like a different experiences that are happening across the board. Like, people have moved and made new decisions about where they're located, and that's changed kind of their ability to shift and take on new roles, or, people who have really young kids and like figuring out that battle, and the ask for the shift from like me, whose kids are a little bit older, where I'm like, oh man, like now I've got to just figure out kind of the morning bus routine, but otherwise everything's okay. And remembering being a young mom and like how much support you needed to have from family or purchased to just manage the mornings and afternoons. It's so much work to do that. And so if you're in that experience now where you've got young kids, being asked to switch from like, I figured out this juggernaut puzzle by working at home and I'm super good at it because I'm a young parent, and young parents are super good at their jobs because they're like maximizing everything that they can, then why do I need to come back? Like, the whiffum for them isn't as strong, right?
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Whiffum being what's in it for me.
Oh, yeah. So that piece, if they're like, I'm doing great work, I get great results, like I'm doing the things that I need to do, it's really hard to make that case. And, I see the CEOs of companies saying, basically, I'm using my best judgment and I think that people need to come back because I really believe that we can do better work if we're all together. But it's not scientifically proven one way or the other, right? There's no research that is like, oh, yes, this is actually it. So there's a lot of judgment that's happening in that space.
You're right that it's not scientifically proven. But I think, first of all, to be clear, I'm all for the hybrid work week. I'm not at all for requiring people to be back in 5 days a week. But I think one thing I often hear that is incomplete and thus inaccurate is people saying, like, the pandemic proved that we can all be remote and still be productive and deliver. And there's a key thing missing from that, which is it proved that people who already knew each other well and had worked in an organization with norms that everyone understood could pivot to working apart. And so you mentioned like, what will things look like 5 years from now? And that's my biggest concern is that 5 years from now, you'll have hired people who have never worked together in a co-located setting. And like, what will be the impact of that on the productivity and the value that the company wants to deliver?
Yeah, and thanks for that segue, Dana, because it gives us an opportunity to kind of share our very unscientific research that we're doing. And I mean very unscientific. It's
Anecdotal,
called
I think, is the term.
Anecdotal is a better word. Yes, anecdotal. Because I think to Dana's point, one, we were all used to working together. Two, we were fearful on so many fronts in the early days of the pandemic, and the work was the one constant that allowed us to get through the day. And I have often said, even on this podcast, that 2020 was likely in my 33-year career my most productive. Roll out of bed, work until I went to sleep at night, because really what else was there to do? And it was that constant that you can control. Now to our anecdotal assessment, and then I'm going to pivot back to the recruitment and retention question. We have been asking, admittedly, early in career, individual contributors primarily, about their preference in their work model, with the assumption, based on the media narrative, that we would get, oh, I don't want to go in the office. I'm not going to work for anybody that wants me to go in the office. And we are at 100% of the population. Now, you could argue that the people that we are talking to are all aggressive, and they're meeting with Dana or I because they're interested in, they're go-getters, right? So that's the audience. And they are saying that they are refusing jobs that are 100% remote. They appreciate hybrid, to Dana's point. Like, I want a little flexibility. And to be honest, we all had a little flexibility before the pandemic. And if they want me 100% remote, I won't take that job. It's too isolating. What are you finding in retention and recruitment along those lines?
I would say that that's my observation as well. That, yeah. And, for early in career people, that building of the relationship and network is so critical. Like, that is the critical step.
So much of our lives came from that, like our friendships.
Yeah. And it's also the time when you're going to try a whole bunch of different things. And to try different things, you need a lot of different people to say yes to you. Like, okay, I'm not really sure what I want to do in HR. Like, I'm going to start out in talent attraction, but what is this like culture team doing? What do they do? Can I do like a short-term assignment over there? Let me try that out. That early in career time is the time to try on as many hats and to build up your skills toolbox as much as you possibly can. And that is so facilitated through relationship.
Well, and this is where I'm like, you have to have some time in the office, because how would you even know there was a culture team doing stuff, right? I mean, if you're 100% remote, I will never forget hearing this thing, asking an employee during the pandemic who had started a new job, thus starting completely remotely, like, what's it like working there? And this person said, well, I can't really tell you what it's like to work at the company. I can tell you what it's like to work with the 5 to 10 people that I have to interact with. And so that's where I think, again, you do have to have some time when you're all together, or how will you get a sense of the overall organization and its culture and all the other stuff that's going on, to your point, which does loop back to, though, that you also need the mid-career people in, because who's going to be giving feedback to these early career people, so it's like, it all kind of loops together. All right. Well, I'm going to ask our last question, which is, the whole reason we're doing this podcast is because we passionately believe that you can have a workplace that's got high standards and high expectations and high goals for execution and delivering. that can also be like a respectful, decent, fun place to work. I keep hearing examples of where people think it's one or the other. And I don't believe that because I've experienced it. Like I know it to be true. So I'm just curious how you approach that. You've got this new team. How are you approaching finding the right balance there?
Dana, it's so interesting because I'm like, really? Like, why would that even be an option in life? To just like work in a place that's only focused on productivity and not focused on
That's not any
relationships.
fun.
Yeah.
It's not any fun. Yeah.
Or effective. It's also not effective.
Oh, it's totally not effective. But like Boeing is a very good example of what happened to an organization that decided to just focus on the productivity and demanding side.
Well, I think like as a leader, having that intention that you're going to do work on both sides because it matters, that doing like the relational development side as well as the like, what are we focused on? How are we going to do it side is really important. And, most organizations, when they have a performance review, will include feedback on both what you did and how you did it. So I take that in the heart when I think about how I'm leading the team. What are we going to do and how are we going to do it together? And I have a very strong belief in alignment and collaboration as being really key to the work. And so taking the time to intentionally figure out and taking the time to do it, what are we aligned against? How are we going to work together? What are our ways of working? How do we collaborate? All of that takes intentional time to build that out in a team.
And for me, I think the key mindset pivot is realizing that that's actually the work. It's not the distraction from the work. So a lot of people will say, yeah, those touchy-feely alignment meetings, yeah, they're good to do, but I'd like to get to the real work, right? And I think the key pivot that I know I've worked with a lot of people on is that that's actually the work. Especially as you rise in the organization and you might get away from the actual like tactical stuff.
Yeah, I was just going to say, I think one of your critical jobs as both a manager and a leader is to create a culture where people bring their best selves to work every day. And I don't know anyone whose best self is 100% on and staunch and, driven 100% of the time. People like to smile occasionally. They like to laugh. They like to have a conversation about your life and what motivates you. And I think bringing that culture of, I'm starting to feel it's a little bit overused, but inclusivity is really important. And with that, once you get to know your teammates, you can have a lot of fun and get a lot of stuff done.
Liz, you are a wise woman. You are a wise woman. And I just so appreciate your willingness to join us.
Yeah, thanks for having me. It's fun.
Yes, thank you for your insight and all of the little clues you gave us about your AI and strategy and business class at MIT Sloan. That was awesome.
More goodness from Liz. All right, let me give you my hot takes. One is I loved her approach to thinking through with your team what sort of hybrid schedule or remote or an office schedule would work. And I love that she pointed out that there's trade-offs to any model. I really liked that.
Yeah. And when we started talking about kind of new to the workforce employees and the risk of that they face not being in the office because you don't know what you don't know if you're not standing by we've overused water cooler analogy, or you're not. But the example around the culture committee, you're coming new to the office, you probably don't even know there's maybe a culture committee or a social committee. And so it's that the fact that you don't know what you're missing if you're not there.
Or even other departments. I mean, the way I got into my career, my initial career was instructional design and learning psychology. And the way I got into that is because I got a basic, junior level sort of admin job at a training company, and I learned that there was this department called instructional design. And then I got to learn to meet those folks. So it's like, yeah, what are the ways that that kind of discovery and exchange can happen in the new workforce, in the new workplace?
And my career is an example of that. Start as a fab engineer and as a global sales leader. It's a very non-traditional path that many of the twists and turns in the movements, whether they be upward or lateral, came because of people I met in places that I had networking opportunities and experiences. And someone would say, hey, you should think about trying XYZ. So I thought that was really insightful. Anything else?
I also think it's interesting that we've had 2 guests now, and they have both brought up the importance of alignment. So, and meaning just, is everybody on the same page? And even if we're not on the same page, can we all agree to how we got to the decision? Meaning like Liz's thing, like, let's talk about the principles for our work and what model best supports that. And even if I'm not thrilled with the decision, I at least understand, like, I'm aligned around how we came to that decision, and so isn't everybody else.
Explain the why. Yeah, and then I think finally, just to wrap, I love the conversation around, as a leader, you have to focus on the what and the how. I know I mentioned this in the intro, but at the end of the day, you achieve the results that you achieve because of the people in the organization, and you have to be intentional on different elements of the interpersonal skills, like collaboration, like alignment, like consistent and ongoing communication, to ensure that you're still aligned, because you don't align once. It's not like you align your tires once and they stay aligned for the rest of the time you have your car. So it's a constant effort in terms of the behaviors to achieve the results.
So right on. Thank you, Liz, again for spending time with us. And we've got a great guest coming next, totally different from our first 2 guests. Join our private LinkedIn group to find out who it is, coming soon.
Yes, and one more thing, Dana, we should also note our new YouTube channel by the same name, Maestro Mindset, where we are taking many times the hot takes that we find during these interviews and posting them on our YouTube channel. So please reach out and join the LinkedIn group as well as the YouTube channel. And until next time, Dana,
signing off.
rock on.